We're back with part 3 of lesson 10. Trying to figure out why JavaScript is not being read on register. So neither function is working. You want to make sure that that script is linked in your header. Okay, so we've linked it. We've linked it in our header file. Also make sure, yeah, as Mike said, that you're doing a hard refresh to make sure you're not getting a cached version of the page. So we should be linking in you may need a hard refresh. So our register's done. We've now got our nifty little show hide icon. We've got our validator, making sure that our passwords match, and we're also validating on our save page. We're hashing the passwords and we're preventing duplicate users from signing up. I think we've got everything we need. We now need to get our login working. So we open our login page. We've got a simpler form, and we can see that it is posting to a page we're going to have to build called validate. So we need to build this page. So we're going to create a new PHP file in our root called validate.php, which matches our form action. Now this is going to be a hidden page. There should never be HTML rendered on here. We're either going to take the user back to the login page if the login is no good. If the login is good, we want to load the artist's page after a successful login. Okay, so again, we'll kind of pseudocode it out. We are going to capture form inputs. We're going to connect. Now, the way this works, because our password is hashed, we actually first check for the username. We're going to check for the username only first. If username not found, redirect to login with error indicator. So some way when the login page loads, we can display an error message there. If username found, hash and compare passwords. Again, if passwords don't match, same thing, redirect to login with an error. Otherwise, login is valid, redirect to main artists. So this is our logic flow here. So some of it is basic and repetitive. A few things that are a little different we haven't got. Capturing user inputs, well, that's pretty damn easy. Grab the username and the password from the form post. We don't need to do any input validation here. We're not saving new data to the database. So if these values are empty, we just don't, that login isn't going to exist. So that's fine. Connecting is easy. So now we want to run the same query we ran on our register page when we were checking for this user. In fact, we can copy and paste that code out of our save registration page. Somebody suggested this morning, well, couldn't we just move that to an include file, like username check, which I suppose you could do. I hadn't really planned on doing it that way, but you could move that. So we want this block of code right here. From our select star from users, where username equals username, binding of the parameter, executing and fetching. Excuse me. So we want to repeat these same 3 lines. I'm just going to copy them, sorry, same 5 lines, and dump them in. So see if there is an account, is there a record in the users table with this username? Then we bind the parameter. Again, you might use 100 characters, mine is 50, and we call fetch. So we can say if not user, so if nothing gets returned from the query, the username doesn't exist. So we don't even care about the password at this point. We'll just disconnect and redirect. So we want to go back to the login page, but we're also going to provide a parameter in the URL so that we can display an error message to the user. It's not really good practice to just reload the login page without telling the user that the login attempt failed. Okay, so we can try it out like this. If I put in some username that isn't in my database, I should get taken back to login, but we should get this parameter appended on to the end of our URL. So I'm just going to check my database again. So here are my 3 valid users. You probably only have 1 valid user. So if I enter any other username here, I should get taken immediately back to the login page with this invalid equals true parameter stuck on the end. Try it. So I'm going to go here, put in a username that I know doesn't exist. I can see it's not here. So when I try to log in, maybe I didn't save my changes, probably not. I'm getting really bad at that. Let me resend my form. Right, so it redirects me to login, but I've got this parameter. So this parameter we can use to make sure we show an error message here. So we should add a regular, like a gray instruction at the top of login, kind of like we have here. But if the page reloads, with this invalid login, we'll toggle the message and we'll also toggle the CSS so that gray message turns blue. So up at the top of our login page, let's add here some logic with a PHP if statement. So if let's say if it's empty, so if there is no error message, we will echo an H6. So if there is no error, there'll just be a gray message at the top of the form that says, please enter your credentials. If there is an error, an invalid parameter in the URL, instead, So the user is going to get one of these two alerts every time this page loads. Gray message saying, please enter your credentials if there are no errors when the page loads. Or if the user has come from a failed login attempt, they're going to get a blue message that says invalid login instead. Now, these should be generic messages. You don't want to say username doesn't exist or wrong password. That's too much information to give a potential hacker. So when a login fails, we don't tell the user why it failed. That's kind of dangerous. So the result of this is my login now looks like this. When I just browse around and try to log in, I get a gray message. If I put in an invalid login, it brings me right back, and now that color toggles, and I see an error message instead. So this is the behavior we're looking for. Now we can go back to validate. I think we're done with the changes on login. We can go back to validate, and now we need to fill out the rest of the code. So we've really just simulated what happens when the username is not found. So that's our first scenario. Our second scenario here, I guess I could wrap the rest of this stuff in an else. So if the username is found, we're going to keep going. So our second scenario is we've got a username, so now we need to hash the password and use the PHP function that will hash the password and compare it to what's in the database. So in this case, we'll say if. We're going to use a function, before we use the function, when we're registering, use the function called password hash. PHP also has a function called password verify that will return a true or false. So we'll say if not, password verify. So if this returns false, and it takes two parameters. What's the plain text password, which is just our password variable. And the second parameter is our hashed password. So this is going to be the password from our user object, the result of our database query. So we are comparing, let's say compare the password entered with the hashed password in the DB query. So take the password entered in the login form, compare it to the password that comes out of the database query. If they are not the same, this method will return false. Return true if the password and hash match, otherwise false. So we're going to do the same things. We've got the right user, but they entered the wrong password. We're going to disconnect. And once again, take them back to the login page with an indicator that we can display an error message there. So I'm going to try my valid username, try logging in with user@gce.ca, but I'm going to make sure I put in a password that's not correct. In that case, login should reload, and there should be a blue message at the top that says invalid login. User@gc.ca. But I know this is the wrong password. My username exists. This is much longer than the password we created, which was only 8 characters. So again, I get the same result as with an invalid username, brings me back here, shows me my login is invalid. So we've handled the first two scenarios. The username doesn't exist, scenario 1. Scenario 2, username exists, but the password is wrong. So then we can add an else in here. So what do we do if the login is valid? So if the login is valid, before we leave this page, we need to access the session, store their identity, and redirect. So before we can read or write any session variables, we need to call a method called session start. This gives us access to the user session on the web server memory. And then we can use the $_session collection to create a session variable. So we're going to create a session variable called username, and we'll store the user's email address here. So once they leave this page, we can check if they're logged in, and also find out what their username is by reading this session variable. So it'll be available so long as they keep their browser open and stay active on our site. So if the username is valid and the password is valid, we are going to store who they are and then take them to the artist page. So I've already simulated scenario 1 and scenario 2. We now need to try out this final scenario. So I'm going to enter my credentials properly now. I'm not sure why my drop-down menu isn't working. Later. Again. And with my proper password of test1234, my login, we know my login is valid because it redirected me to the artist page. Yes, Dominic, that's what we're going to do. We're going to do that next week. So we're going to do a couple of things next week. Not only are we going to make it so we can only delete or edit, as well as add, but we're going to hide these links. So an anonymous user will see the artists. This link is hidden. This whole column is hidden. And the artist names are also plain text. They won't be links either. So there'll basically be two versions of the website without us having to create any new pages. An anonymous user can read, they can see the artists, but an authenticated user can also add, edit, or delete. So we're going to implement that next week. The other thing that we we'll add is the ability to log out. So we'll see the site change when we log in, navigate around, and then change back again once we log out. So we're going to have different access, and we will see certain elements be shown or hidden depending on whether we're logged into the site or not. So we're going to implement all of those things next week. And then we're also going to talk about SSL security. Yama, could we do it so that each user makes their own artist list? Yes. If we want to be able to do that, then we should do something else here as well. Okay, we can start. So one thing we'll need to do is in our login, not only do we want to store the session username, but we'll also need to store the user ID. And then in our database, in the artist table, we're also going to need to allow a user ID foreign key, right? So every artist record is linked to a user account. So that might mean, Yama, that you and I both add the same artist record. So it might get repeated, right? One of them is tied to your account, one of them is tied to my account. So we could do that. That's not a bad idea. So we could set this up. Let's do that as well. So let's set up our session user ID so we can use this as a foreign key. And this is going to be equal to our user object. Right? We're fetching the user in our query here, so we'll have access to their user ID. So we're going to have two session variables. The username will display that in our header when someone logs in, and the ID we can use as a foreign key when someone goes to save a new artist. We'll also need to modify our database. So we are going to add, I'm going to alter table artists. We're going to add a column, user ID int. Now for the moment, we can't say not null because we already have artist records in there without a user ID. So I'm not going to set it as a foreign key or make it not null for now. Paste this in so we can run this script. And then what I'll do is I'll maybe take one of my existing user ID and I'll attach all of the existing artists to that user. Okay, so I'm going to highlight and execute that script. If I refresh, I've now got a user ID. Now, probably you all have user ID 1. So the other thing I'll do now is I'm going to attach all the existing artists to one of my valid user IDs. Let's update artists, set user ID. I'll set mine to 3, where user ID is null. So you're probably going to have user ID 1. I'm going to attach them to user ID 3. Oh, it gives me this one without a where clause. Okay, you may get this error. You're using safe update mode. Just paste this in the chat. Change the ID to 1. There's a setting that prevents us from updating like all the records in our table. So I'm going to turn it off. If I go to I think it's Tools. Bear with me. I have a Server option. It's in here somewhere. Haven't done it for a little while. Thank you. Edit and Preferences. Under yeah, you can do it in here as well. I'm just trying to remember where it is. Under SQL execution, I think. At the bottom of the SQL main editor tab. Under SQL editor, thank you. You can, so go to Edit Preferences, SQL Editor, Safe Updates. I'm going to uncheck that. So this will let me update. Oh, I may have to run reconnect to server. The query reconnect. Okay, so now I've been able to update. So I'll show that one more time under Edit and Preferences. Click on SQL Editor and scroll to the bottom. You can uncheck Safe Updates and click OK. And then you just click on Query and Reconnect to Server. Then we can run our update. So now all my artists are tied to this user ID. And so all my artists now have a user ID here. So we'll modify our code as well next week that when we add an artist, first of all, add or edit, it has to be an artist that belongs to our account. And we also can only delete an artist tied to our own account. So we'll have to add that in to our existing pages for artist details, saving, and deleting an artist, that one user cannot modify an artist created by another user. So we'll make those changes next week. And we will also add the ability to log out and then make changes in our navigation bar. Okay, so I'm going to upload everything we've done to GitHub. So for next week, what do you need to do? Make sure you have participated in the Miro board, and I'll grade those probably tomorrow. Make sure you're clear on the differences between sessions and cookies and hashing and encryption. You should have created the users table and gotten the registration and login code working. Please start on assignment 2. Do not leave it. It is too big to leave to the end. And then there is a review quiz on authentication in your lesson 11 folder that's due Sunday night. Okay, so we will wrap up here. I will get the videos uploaded in a little while. When they're done processing, I will get my code up on GitHub in a moment. Okay, that's all for today. You're free to go. I can stay in the room for a few minutes if anyone has questions. Lab 4 is due tonight at midnight. But all you need to do is post your sticky note to the board.